Hello, and welcome to the Godot community for High School Visual Art 3D.
When your plaster mold has thoroughly dried, you can go ahead and start casting. Typically, I will pour the slip into the center of the form. You want to make sure that it's nice and mixed before you pour it. And you're going to pour till your slip is just bubbling up on the edge, like it's about ready to overflow, but it's not quite there. And what's going to happen is as the moisture is absorbed into the plaster, then you're going to see that your slip actually becomes a little bit sunken down into your mold. And you may then need to apply or add a little bit more to it. But otherwise, we're going to just walk away and check back in about 15 to 20 minutes to see if we need to add more slip, or if not, are the walls set up enough for us to pour some of the slip out. Typically, the wall thickness should be about 1/4 of an inch. If it's thinner than that, then it probably isn't going to stand the process of removing it from the mold. If the walls are thicker than that, then you have a risk for the clay cracking because the slip has sat in the mold for so long and it's set up so quickly. And poured in my plaster mold, and I did this about, I would say 15-20 minutes ago. And when I turn it on its edge, you'll see that the slip that's in the center is starting to sort of slide out of the form. We can see there's some movement there. But we can also see, if we look around the edge, that the slip is starting to set up. It's going to set up around the edge first because that plaster is pulling the moisture out of the casting slip. And even though there isn't a lot of casting or a lot of water in the casting slip, there is some. And just like regular clay, it's going to be absorbed by plaster. And not only that, it may shrink. So you might find that when you are slip casting, after you pour your slip into your mold, you may want to check on it 5 minutes or so, depending on how big the mold is, to see if it has sunk down. And if it has, you may need to top it off. I'm going to just take my slip container and I am going to pour that slip that is not set back into my container of slip to live another day and be used again. And I can see as I'm doing that the thickness of my walls is probably a little thin for what I would normally want to do. So I could pour the slip back in now that I get a better sense of this wall thickness, which looks to be not quite at 1/4 of an inch. 1/4 of an inch is really where we want it. So just going to pour it back in. Maybe overdid it a little bit. This is why you always want to work on a towel or your canvas. So I'm going to let that sit for another 10, 15, maybe even 20 minutes before I pour it out again. The casting slip has stiffened up enough for me to remove my casting from my plaster mold. So you can see I ended up going back and pouring the excess slip back into my container. And you can see that the wall thickness now is more at about 1/4 of an inch. I'll start by taking my fettling knife and just removing any casting slip that goes beyond the border of my tile here. And I'm cutting away from the tile. If I would cut towards the center of the tile, I would pull the wall and it would become misshapen. Okay. If you try to do this too quickly or too soon, then when you turn your tile over, especially if you've got a design that's a little bit higher relief, it could end up collapsing. If you wait too long, then just like with regular clay, as it would shrink, it would get caught on some of your detail and it potentially could get cracks. And if it stiffened up too much, it could actually dry onto your detail, onto your mold. And then in removing it, you could potentially lose that detail. So once I have the extra cutaway, I'll hold my mold so that I am holding down the corner, and I'll just tap it against my hand. And you can see that that corner is already released. So then I will go back. And here we have it. We got a little bit of damage on the corner, but that's okay because this casting slip still has some flexibility to it and can be repaired. Now, I've used this mold several times, so I know that any undercuts that I may have had in my original design have been taken care of. If this were the first pull off of a brand new mold, then it would be at that time that you would know, you would learn if you indeed had any undercuts. You would also typically throw your first casting away, whether it had undercuts or not, because you are going to have little bits of plaster stuck here and there. And typically it's suggested that you don't fire plaster. Plaster doesn't shrink, clay does. So if you get a piece of plaster embedded in your clay, it potentially could crack it. But since this one's been used and I know that all the undercuts were taken care of when I had originally made it, then I am ready to put this aside. And then depending on how wet my mold has become from having the slips in it, I may be able to go ahead and pour another casting, or I might want to wait for the mold to dry before I attempt another one. But I am set up to go ahead and start making my multiples.